Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at thechangeleader.com. This episode of Changing Higher Ed is sponsored by Perdea Education, a national leader in online student recruitment and enrollment services, providing institutions enrolled students risk-free on a performance-based model with no long-term contract. If your online programs could benefit from incremental online student enrollments, visit PerdeaEducation.com. That's P-E-R-D-I-A education.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. This being our last episode of the year, we're going to continue our tradition we started a couple of years ago, where we look back at the year in higher ed and we get out the crystal ball for prognostications for 2021. Helping me again this year is TCL's Deb Maue, our marketing and positioning expert, who will be again putting me on the hot seat. Deb, welcome back to the show. It seems like we do this every year.
We do it every year, and it's one of the highlights of the end of the year for me. I look forward to it every year.
Oh, likewise. And we get to go back and see how wrong we were with our predictions for this year.
That's always the most fun part.
Oh, I think we all can stand to be humbled just a little bit.
I agree.
2020 was just one of those crazy kind of years. In some ways, it reminds me of everything that happened with the Great Recession. It happened virtually overnight. It was completely unpredictable, and we still haven't recovered, and it's going to be a long time before we recover.
Yeah, anybody who is doing an end-of-year podcast like this and looking at how they did in their predictions for this year is not going to look too good. I don't think anybody had global pandemic on their bingo card for 2020.
Oh, we sure didn't. That's for sure.
No, we didn't.
It's been a tough year. What can we say?
It has been a tough year.
Yeah. There's been a lot of good stuff come out of it.
Yeah. So let's start there. So rather than starting on a down note, let's talk first about what the good things were that came out of 2020. What do you think?
Well, that's great. We just wrapped up that segment. That was quick. No, seriously. There, with every dark cloud, there's always a silver lining, and there certainly were in this as well. We had people stepping up. What comes to mind is Russell Lowery-Hart, the president of Amarillo College, who really did a great job in servant leadership and showing students this is the way that you're truly a leader, getting out on the front lines, testing people for COVID, helping them, using a mask, demonstrating these kind of behaviors. I mean, that's the kind of leader I want for my college.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think there were some great examples of leadership, particularly presidents really stepping up and setting the example for their campuses. And also, I think just being very present for their students. I know at my own institution, Aurora University, our president was just in constant communication with the campus about everything that was happening. And I think there were a lot of examples of that across the country.
There certainly were. And, transparency and good communications, is critical in a crisis. One of the things that really, I embraced and I thought was fabulous is how institutions turned on a dime when things got shut down in the spring. I mean, people were converting their entire course load to online in a week to 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. Now, everyone says faculty can't change, but there's a great example where if there's good impetus and good reason for changing, faculty and everyone else will change.
I agree. I think it was incredible the speed with which people adapted and willingly adapted to shifting their classes to remote learning. I also think that when you talk about the speed with which things happened, just the speed that campuses, reacted with in getting the campus ready for those of us who returned to campus, just getting PPE and getting plastic dividers and getting hand sanitizer and getting everything that we needed. It happened so quickly. And so I think there was a lot of that. I think there were a lot of examples of that kind of speed in reaction.
Yeah. One of the neat things that I saw is it forced institutions to really figure out what their mission is. And it's obviously educating students. Billy Hawkins, the president at Talladega College, checked in with great regularity with students. This was noticed by students. It was noticed by parents. There was great communications. They meet monthly or have been meeting monthly with student leaders to find out what's going on. I mean, it's these kind of communications that really make that college and university experience so important for students.
Mm-hmm. Those are great examples of great things. Any other positives that you saw coming out of the dumpster fire that was 2020?
Well, there were some other ones. Lori Varlotta, who recently just joined Cal Lutheran from Hiram, they were able to go through a very large academic prioritization process to where they cut out a number of programs that really weren't benefiting the students. It wasn't benefiting the university. But what made it really unique was, and Lori is a fabulous fundraiser, she went out and fundraised for those faculty who were going to be laid off to make sure that they had benefits, that they had a salary for a full year after the layoff. I mean,
wow.
You just don't see that.
No, that's incredible.
And it's incredible to have those kind of things. Yeah, institutions, you've got to be able to cut back on programs, and we're seeing a lot of that right now. But to be able to do it in such a humane way is fabulous. And right. Kudos to Lori for doing this.
Right. I think that's a great example of a president really stepping up to help faculty and staff. What about institutions helping students? Because there was a tremendous amount of student need that came out of the pandemic in terms of, students losing jobs, parents losing jobs. Did you see good examples of institutions helping students this year?
Absolutely. And I go back to Amarillo College again, putting in new counseling services for students, doing campus visits online versus other ways of doing, the face-to-face. There's some other great institutions out there. Texas A&M being one of them. I had Tom Mars on the podcast a few weeks ago talking about employee burnout and how employees have been under such stress for so long, and what institutions are doing to help those folks with the COVID issues. You can only imagine what it's like for a parent to have lost a child due to COVID, or a child lose parents, or losing your friends to this, or being sick with no relief on the horizon. It really weighs on people's ability to do their jobs. And having folks like Tom and others who are out counseling people and helping them through these difficult times, I mean, those are some of the great things that I've seen come out of higher ed. When I look at higher ed, I always think about it's supposed to be more humane. It's supposed to be helping people grow, to evolve. And in many cases, it hasn't been that way. And having a pandemic like this gets people back in touch with their humanity and being, thinking about others before they think about themselves. It's a wonderful thing in many respects.
Yeah, I agree. I know, again, at my own institution, we started a fund for students who had short-term needs, paying the rent, paying the electrical bill, and we raised close to $1 million to help students who needed it.
That's fabulous. And you hear about these kind of examples more and more. You just have to dig down and get past all the difficulties surrounded by COVID. I mean, I know we can talk about the good things, but really we need to sum up the year. And, the year is pretty much blah. It's horrible.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. So we talked, it's good to start on a high note. We talked about some of the good things that came out of it. Let's talk more about the challenges.
Yeah.
What were the challenges for higher ed in 2020?
Well, I think they can be summed up with three things: enrollment, enrollment, and enrollment.
Yes, agreed.
The enrollment is difficult to best. I mean, college enrollment this year fell 2.5%. Fall this year to fall the previous year, almost twice the rate of decline from 2019, and it represented almost 500,000 students. And this is, data from the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center that was released last week.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I mean, 327,000 fewer first-time students this fall, unprecedented. International students down 43%, publics down 4%, privates flat, but that was only because the graduate enrollment really helped boost them back up. Mm-hmm. Community colleges down over 13%, transfer students dropped. A couple of bright lights: for-profits went up over 5%, graduates up 3.6%. Some good points there, but frankly, the enrollment is suffering. Multiple reasons for this.
So community colleges as you said, took a real hit. Any speculation as to why community colleges were hit so hard? I think there was some belief up front that maybe community colleges would do okay because of their price point.
Well, I think the challenge being with, and this is just speculation on my part, I haven't read anything on this, is the majority of folks who attend community colleges are lower income demographics, one, and two, they're looking for a way to be able to get into a four-year university. Now, those transfer rates from 2 to 4s were definitely down. So I'm thinking it's more of a demographic and a finance perspective than it is anything else.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. I think part of the challenge is America and the world really has never experienced anything like this in at least 100 years. When we take a look at the death toll, we've lost more people this year to COVID than we have in any war we've ever fought in other than World War II. I mean, to date, we've lost 335,000 people to COVID. And World War II, it was 405. And we were in World War II for 4 years.
Right.
So the death rate is huge. The daily death rate exceeds the death rate from 9/11.
Right.
And so
it's staggering.
It's staggering, and it's fundamentally changing everything on the planet and in our nation. And that's not a bad thing. There's a lot of things out there that really need to change. I mean, you and I have talked about this. We've got far too many universities out there.
Yes.
We've talked about it from a positioning, from a branding perspective. I still think we're going to lose probably about 15 to 20% of all higher ed institutions are no longer going to exist in name. They're going to be acquired by someone else, or they're going to go out of business. But we'll get into the prognostications a little bit later. One of the challenges, obviously, is finances. Moody's is predicting that the net tuition revenue is going to decline in about 75% of private schools and 60% of publics. I mean, that's a huge number of declining revenues. That's not revenues are going to decline by 75%, but 75% of private institutions are going to suffer declining revenues.
Right, right.
One of the big challenges, private universities, they figure room and board comes in at about 40% of their revenues.
Yes. That
makes it challenging. With the publics, we saw this happen, especially with the Great Recession, where the cost didn't change, but the state governments quit putting as much money into the public institutions. And so the tuition rate ended up being more on the students than it did on the states.
Right.
And so students' costs, tuitions continued to go up. We've got 1.7 trillion in student debt out there right now. I mean, that's huge, and that's unsustainable.
Yeah.
One bright note, Southern New Hampshire University just set a limit to their annual tuition for their programs at $10,000 a year for online and $15,000 at face-to-face. I mean, how do you compete? You're seeing a lot of students transferring over to online because the costs are less. How do institutions, right, private institutions, compete with that?
Or public institutions for that matter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
COVID obviously completely transformed higher education in this year. Completely, I guess it remains to be seen if it will transform it, but it certainly dramatically affected it in this year. But there were other things going on in the world in 2020 as well, and particularly in this country, we had Black Lives Matter throughout the year, and with a number of incidents, number of flare-ups. So, how did that affect higher ed in this year?
Well, it affected it in a major way. It gave this type of activism a renewed sense of urgency. You had activists on campus, both faculty and students, demanding that more emphasis, more attention be given to these type of issues, especially higher ed and its relationship to police. Some campuses said, that's it, we're not going to have any more police on campus anymore. It's, quoting from Devin Fergus, who's a professor of history and Black studies at the University of Missouri. There's been such a long history, the blurring between the lines of town and gown between what happens on campus and what happens in the community for African Americans. When I go off campus, my experiences are really no different from any other African American. So higher ed's got a lot of work that it needs to do. It's a very, very difficult situation. We've seen a lot of universities renaming buildings. Mm-hmm. You've seen statues coming down of Confederate generals. You saw the superintendent of Virginia Military Institute resign mm-hmm. because of racist accusations that were going on at that school. There's a lot of things that have to be done. I mean, we've got 4 major things that have happened this year. We have COVID, we have Black Lives Matter, we have climate change, and we've got the economy. And all of these things are major in themselves. I hate to use a term that's overused, but we have a perfect storm mm-hmm. of so many things. And it's almost like the divine is saying, folks, you need to wake up. You need to start doing things a little bit differently. I love the quote from Gordon Gee, who's the president of West Virginia University. Mm-hmm. He says the pandemic has accelerated needed change in higher ed by a decade or more. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're seeing.
Mm-hmm. I think that's absolutely true. I think that's absolutely true. And I think we would have seen a lot more campus activism around Black Lives Matter if it hadn't been for the pandemic. That's probably a blinding glimpse of the obvious that statement. But I mean, it's kind of surprising that we didn't see more activism, but I think it's due to the fact that everyone was just dealing with COVID this year.
I think you're right. But you're also seeing a lot of protests, especially around the election. You're seeing mm-hmm. the Proud Boys coming out. You're seeing, Boogaloo Boys, all of these considered to be white supremacists. Mm-hmm. A lot of things coming out, racial clashes. It's almost like there's a battle for the soul of America. Mm-hmm. And mm-hmm. what is that soul? There was one battle about this about 150, 160 years ago called the Civil War. And I don't think that some of those issues were ever resolved. Mm-hmm. You can do away with slavery by proclamation, but you can't do away with bigotry. You can't do away and just wave a magic wand and say, okay, we're going to be a diverse society. We're going to be equal. We're going to have inclusion. It doesn't happen that way.
Right.
I remember years ago, my father was a pilot, a ship pilot for many years. He was at the Boston Navy Yard and the Panama Canal pilot. And if any listeners or you remember the name Elmo Zumwalt, he was the CNO, the Chief of Naval Operations, who integrated the Navy, who had people serving. And my father knew him. He was quite a man. He almost drove his ship into the pier at the Boston Navy Yard because a 50-cent fuse burned out in the engine order telegraph, and they couldn't get the backup orders for the ship down to the engine room. They finally got him down there, and the ship stopped about 2 feet shy of the pier.
Wow.
But if it weren't for that type of thing, that type of integration, I don't know where the Navy would be nowadays. I just read this morning that the first woman has been named to be the commanding officer of the USS Abraham Lincoln, a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. This has never happened before.
Wow.
So we're starting to see these type of things with women. We need to see them with people of color as well.
Right.
These same type of things.
Right.
Title IX. Major things happened with Title IX under Betsy DeVos with the Department of Education. They changed many of the rules on the way Title IX violations, sexual abuse, sexual harassment are adjudicated. I think that a lot of these things, and we'll get a little bit into the predictions, I think a lot of the things are going to be set aside because it's like a pendulum. The pendulum under the Obama administration had gone completely over to the rights of the victim. Now the pendulum has swung back too much. And so things are going to be changed with that. Distance education, that's one of the silver linings in all the pandemic. There were significant changes. Higher ed had to move over to distance ed to be able to serve students. But with the negotiated rulemaking from 2019 that went into effect this year, there's been a significant number of changes to the rules, which in some cases are going to be very good. For example, substantive interaction. That whole thing, that's going to give rise to more institutions similar to Western governors, where they're doing competency-based education. It's not going to be the faculty member being the sage on the stage as much as it is going to be flipped classroom. It's going to be the students being more in charge of their learning, and, interaction with the faculty member is going to be good, but it only has to be once a week, according to the new regulations. So there's going to be some major changes with distance ed. Mergers. I think we're going to continue to see more mergers, more closures. We had one real big one this year with University of Arizona acquiring Ashford University, which is fully online. That helps University of Arizona expand their online programs. But you've got the other side of it as well, where headline just came out recently that Judson College may close unless it receives like $1 million worth of gifts by Friday. So it's a mixed bag with all of these things.
Agreed. One of the things that you predicted for last year was that the NCAA would need to look at restructuring. I think it's interesting the things that are happening with the NCAA. I think that the way things evolved particularly with football this fall, really exposed a lot of the inner workings of the NCAA, particularly that some conferences have more power in the NCAA than others. What do you think about the NCAA and changes there on the horizon?
Well, it's going to change. There's a case before the Supreme Court right now about paying athletes. I think that's probably going to come up to say, yes, If you're going to use an athlete's image, then you need to compensate them. So it's going to make the rich richer, because students are going to want to go play for someone where they can get more publicity. It's going to be challenging from the NCAA's perspective. I mean, California has already ruled that you pay student athletes. I'm not sure that I agree with it. I understand why it's coming about, but there's that traditional side of me that says, hey, what about amateur athletes? Is there even such a thing? I mean, now in the Olympics, we allow professionals to play, which I think is a good thing. But from a college perspective, I don't know. I really don't have an opinion. And for me, not to have an opinion is pretty
very
unusual.
Very unusual. Well, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how things evolve with the NCAA this year.
Yeah. I guess that means we're in the predictions now.
Well, I think it's time.
Or the scorecard.
I think it's time. We can just, kind of throw out the scorecard from last year. I think no one did very well on their predictions for this year.
Oh, so, I think it's good to have these humbling moments.
Right.
And so,
absolutely.
A first prediction was fundraising is going to be changing. Yeah, absolutely. COVID is definitely changing how fundraising is doing. Maybe not the way we predicted it, but it certainly is changing. And especially when you pull Black Lives Matter into it, and some of the things along like that, changing names on buildings. I mean, if you have a donor who wants his or her name on a building, are you going to accept that money if there may be, Jeffrey Epstein as an example?
Right.
So there's going to be more due diligence on that. I think we're already seeing the acceleration of closures and mergers.
Yes.
Not quite at the rate that we thought it would be. I'm actually kind of surprised. And I think a lot of that has to do with the CARES Act and getting higher ed some money. I mean, they didn't get higher ed the money that they really needed. The first go around was 12 or 13 billion. This time it's about 14 billion, which is more. It's not the 120 billion that they wanted, but it's better than a poke in the eye. Discount rates, costs. I think this year that's, if we're looking at, green check marks for we hit it right or red check marks, we hit it wrong. I think that's definitely a red check mark because, the discount costs went up, but they were covered in part for the CARES Act. Right.
What about, you had predicted that institutions would increase their partnerships with businesses to develop curriculum and credentials. Is that something that you see as just sort of being delayed a bit as a result of COVID and everything that happened this year?
I think it's starting now, but I don't think it's starting at the degree. Folks that I speak with and, higher ed administrators, they're just hunkered down trying to figure out, are we going to be able to stay in class face to face or are we going to have to go online? I mean, we had people, spring term was a mess. Fall term, oh yeah, we're all coming back. And not so fast. That didn't work out real well. I don't think we're going to get back to normal until fall of 2021. I think that's going to be it. The vaccine is going to be a big thing. Testing needs to continue as well.
I think it'll be, when we talk about normal, I think the big question is what does normal look like? I hate the term new normal, but I mean, what does it look like? And particularly around enrollment, I think it's a big question mark. Are we going to see even bigger enrollment declines next year than we saw this year? But now I'm getting into predictions.
Well, I think that's a good segue to get to predictions because frankly, 2020, the crystal ball it was cloudy last year. And I mean, I can't even see anything in it this time.
It's a virtual snow globe.
I think it's going to be interesting because you're seeing, I think you're going to continue to see enrollment drops. Part of that is going to be due to the enrollment cliff that we're coming up to. But I think a lot of that is going to also be as part of the finances because of the COVID pandemic. I think we're going to definitely see drop there. Another interesting thing that's happening is traditional age students are heading more to online universities in larger numbers. Western Governors, Southern New Hampshire, and now Ashford as part of University of Arizona. These big universities are doing very, very well and will continue to do well. And I think you're going to see a lot of them gobbling up other programs or alliances with MOOCs to be able to keep costs down.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think, a lot of students, a lot of traditional age undergrad students, when things went remote, a lot of them said, I don't like this remote learning. I want to be back face to face. But there were also quite a few who said, I do like the remote learning and I want to go online. I think it's forcing a lot of institutions that had not encouraged or not allowed traditional age undergrad students to take online classes are having to rethink that because students are wanting it. They're demanding it.
They are. And especially where you see that the percentage of your post-traditional students, to borrow a definition from Carol Aslanian, mm-hmm. your post-traditionals are making up more and more of the students going to school. Mm-hmm. Graduates or degree completions are big, and they need that flexibility that online education can give them. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm kind of excited about the election.
That's just what I was going to ask you about. So apparently we're going to have a new administration in a few weeks.
Yeah.
And so what are your predictions around that, around a Biden presidency?
Well, I think education is going to come back to being more of in the forefront versus off to the side. One of the big things from Trump and DeVos was student choice and pushing money to private schools, et cetera. I think that's going to get curtailed a bit. The new ed secretary has a very strong background in public education, coming from the state of Connecticut. Mm-hmm. I think that's going to be very, very good for public institutions. And, traditionally your ed secretary has come from a K-12 background, and this gentleman does as well. So I think that's a good thing. You're going to see more money. If in fact there's another CARES Act that gets passed, you're going to see more money steered to higher education through that. I think having Jill Biden in the White House, Dr. Jill Biden.
Yes, that's very exciting.
That's a first one. It is. And she will have a bigger influence, I think, on education than most people will stop and think. I hope, and this is just a hope, that there becomes less I can never say this word right. Politicalization? No, I know that's right. What's the word I'm looking for?
I don't know.
Politicization? Making education less political.
Okay,
there we go. That makes it.
There you go.
So I hope we get to that. I think it's a little ways away, but hopefully we can get to that point where people understand that education is a opening and it's an awakening of people's intellects, their minds, and in some ways their souls if it's done right. Mm-hmm. And it's not about, holding on to old norms. It's about exploring and finding out what the norms are for you personally. Mm-hmm. Being able to understand and listen to an opposing point of view. I remember one of my favorite movies, The American President with Michael Douglas. He talked about how politics and free speech is very, very difficult. It's you screaming at the top of your lungs about something you believe in and your opponent doing the same thing. and realizing that you both have the right to say it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's up to these kids coming in to be able to come to their own decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, it all goes out the window if we have a Republican majority in the Senate.
Right. So you've been predicting the acceleration of mergers and acquisitions and closures, and you've been predicting that for a number of years. And as you said earlier, it hasn't really accelerated. What's your prediction around that for next year?
Oh, I can't let that one go. I got to keep that.
You're like a dog with a bone.
Absolutely. I think this year may be the year. We'll see.
This is your year when you're going to get it right.
One of these years I will. The big challenge, I think, is going to be this first year of the pandemic has been difficult. First 9 months on institutions. Most institutions, many of them have been able to survive and they'll do okay. But I also think that a lot of them have been bled deeply. And, they've lost a lot of blood. They've lost a lot of money. And are they going to be able to survive with the reduced finances? I mean, 3/4 of all CFOs in higher ed are saying, I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm.
And so with that, are they going to be able to survive? We'll see. But I'm not ready to let that bone go just yet.
Okay. What about enrollment? So right now, last I checked, applications were down overall and nationally, and also FAFSA filing was down pretty significantly, about 10%, I think, from last year at this time. Do you think that's just a lag? Do you think it's just timing? Or do you think that truly enrollment's going to be down significantly next fall?
I hope not, but I think it's going to be down probably the same amount that it was this year, 2.5%, 3%. Like I said earlier, there's finances that are playing into it, but also too, we're coming up to the enrollment cliff based on the Great Recession. That's, it's coming into play, and there aren't as many traditional college age students out there. The positive note is graduate education and degree completion is moving up, and that's balancing out a lot of the enrollment. But again, institutions have got to be positioned properly. They really need to understand what their mission is. They really need to understand what programs speak to who their ideal student is.
What do you predict, back to the Biden administration, what do you predict around either free college or loan forgiveness, two topics that were pretty prominent during the election?
I think free college is a great idea for up to certain income levels. And I know Biden's platform that he ran on was free community college and free 4 years for those people whose parents are making less than $125,000 a year. I think that's a great idea. I don't know if it's going to happen. I think the forgiveness of the debt is far more realistic. The question becomes is how much do you forgive? That's the big thing. You can, and Biden can do this with the stroke of a pen. He can do this via executive order. But the question again, how much is fair? There's folks out there who have gone $300,000-$400,000 in debt to go back to medical school, dental school, whatever. You've got some folks who are just perpetual students and have run up $100,000-$200,000 in debt. Should their debt be forgiven? That's beyond my level of expertise. We will see some.
Agreed. Mine too.
We will see some.
What else do you predict for next year?
A much better year than this year. Much better year. I think the game changer is going to be the vaccine. I think the vaccine is going to make a big difference. Higher ed, as we've known it, the go-go years back, leading up to the Great Recession, they're gone. We're just not going to see those anymore. We need to do better job in partnering with businesses, employers to find out what they need. I mean, too many graduates are coming out of schools right now unprepared to join the workforce. And so we've got to do a better job in preparing students. But there's another piece with that is faculty, yes, they do a good job in teaching their subjects, but the purpose of higher ed is for the greater good, and it's to develop lifelong learners. There is no way that in college you're going to learn everything you need for your entire career. You're going to need to go back to school. You're going to need to study. You're going to need to look at different ways of increasing your skills and getting new skills. Higher ed is not meant, you've got to make people ready for that first job, but you've got to instill in them, and I think this goes to that higher purpose for higher ed, is you've got to instill in them that desire for lifelong learning. When you do that, and when a student can come back and look and say, this institution changed me to where it prepared me for my life, then you've accomplished your mission. Agreed.
And on that note,
Deb, it's always a pleasure, and we'll have to do this again next year.
We absolutely will. I'm anxious to see how you do.
Absolutely. Well, happy holidays to you. Happy holidays to everyone listening, and a very happy and prosperous and fruitful new year.
Agreed. May 2021 be a better year for everyone. Thank you.
Thanks for listening this week, and a special thank you to my co-host, Deb Maue. We hope you enjoyed this podcast, and we'll be back to our regular podcast format next time with the podcast which will feature Barbara Mistick, President of the National Association of Independent Colleges and Universities, who'll be joining us to share her thoughts on what private colleges and universities should be doing now to grow and remain viable. I also want to give a special shout out to our sponsor, Perdea Education. Visit PerdeaEducation.com to learn about how they can help grow your online student enrollment through a performance-based model with no risk or long-term contracts to your institution. We wish you and yours a very happy new year. Until next time, we'll see you later.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.